The morning sun rose over New Savannah like it did every other day, casting orange light across the colony buildings that humans had built on this distant world. The planet sat 300 light-years from Earth, one of dozens of colonies where people had come to start new lives among the stars. The air smelled different here, sweeter somehow because the plants were not quite like Earth plants, and the bacteria in the soil produced strange chemicals that made everything feel alien and familiar at the same time. Maya Johnson walked toward the security checkpoint with her sample case in one hand and her data pad in the other. She was thinking about her research, about the bacteria she had been growing for the past 6 months, about how excited her team would be when she showed them the latest results. The bacteria glowed in the dark, a soft blue-green light that came from their biology, and she believed they could be used to light entire buildings without using any power at all. It was the kind of work that made her glad she had left Earth, glad she had taken the risk to come out here where everything was new and anything seemed possible. She was 26 years old and had been on New Savannah for almost 2 years. Her mother called her every week from Earth, asking when she would visit home, telling her about family dinners and neighborhood gossip and all the small things that felt very far away. Maya always promised she would come home soon, maybe in a few months, maybe when her current project was finished. She had said the same thing to her mother just last night, sitting in her small apartment and watching the alien stars through her window, while her mother's voice carried across 300 light-years of empty space. The checkpoint was busier than usual. Security had been tight for weeks because someone had been smuggling illegal tech through the colony, or at least that was the rumor everyone talked about in the cafeterias and common areas. Maya did not pay much attention to colony politics or security concerns. She was a scientist, and her world was bacteria and growth rates and careful measurements. She trusted that security knew what they were doing, and that she had nothing to worry about because she had nothing to hide. Officer Kyle Morrison stood at the checkpoint scanning people as they passed through. He had been awake for 16 hours because he was working a double shift and his eyes felt dry, and his patience was wearing thin. He was tired of this colony, tired of the heat and the strange smells and the constant sense that something was about to go wrong. He had been a coalition security officer for 15 years and had served on 7 different worlds. But New Savannah was wearing on him in ways the other places had not. He watched Maya approach, and something in his mind flagged her as different, as potentially dangerous, though he could not have said exactly why if someone had asked. She was just another colonist, just another person passing through his checkpoint on the way to work. But his hand moved closer to his weapon without him consciously deciding to move it, and his body tensed in a way that happened automatically now after so many years of training and so many warnings about threats that might come from anywhere. Maya stepped up to the scanner and placed her sample case on the conveyor. The machine hummed as it analyzed what was inside, running through thousands of threat profiles in seconds. Then an alarm sounded, a sharp beeping that made everyone in the checkpoint area turn and look. Maya's eyes went wide with surprise because she had passed through this checkpoint 100 times before, and the alarm had never gone off once. The scanner screen showed an energy signature, something unusual coming from inside her sample case. Morrison saw the alert and his training took over. All those years of drills and procedures and warnings about hidden weapons and dangerous materials. He pulled his plasma weapon from its holster and pointed it at Maya, his voice loud and sharp as he ordered her to raise her hands and step away from the case. Maya felt her heart jump in her chest, but she did what he said immediately. Her hands went up, palms open, and she started to explain about the bacteria, about how they naturally produced a low-level energy signature because of their biology. The words tumbled out of her mouth fast because she was scared now, because there was a weapon pointed at her and she needed the officer to understand that everything was fine, that this was just a misunderstanding, that the bacteria were harmless. Morrison saw a young woman with dark skin and raised hands and heard words coming from her mouth, but his mind was already committed to seeing a threat. 2 seconds passed, maybe 3, time enough for a person to take a breath or blink or realize they had made a mistake. Maya stood completely still with her hands up and her face showing fear and confusion. She did not move toward Morrison, and she did not reach for anything, and she did not do a single thing that any reasonable person would call threatening. Morrison pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt hit Maya in the chest and burned through her body in an instant. She fell backward and hit the floor hard, her head bouncing once against the permacrete. The sample case fell to and broke open, spilling bacteria cultures across the checkpoint floor where they glowed softly in the artificial light. Other officers rushed forward, shouting into their radios for medical help. But Morrison just stood there with his weapon still raised and his mind trying to catch up with what his body had just done. Maya died 4 minutes later while medics worked over her body. Her last thoughts were confused and painful, her mind unable to understand why this was happening, why she was dying on the floor of a security checkpoint when she had done nothing wrong. She thought about her mother and about her research and about all the things she would never get to do now. And then her thoughts stopped and she was gone. The bacteria continued to glow on the floor around her body, beautiful and harmless and completely misunderstood. Captain Linda Hayes arrived on New Savannah 30 hours after the shooting and immediately demanded to see all the footage from the checkpoint cameras. She was a senior investigator for Coalition Internal Affairs, the department that looked into incidents where security officers used force against civilians. She had done this work for 12 years and had investigated hundreds of cases, but something about this one bothered her before she even saw the video. Maybe it was the reports that were already flooding the colonial networks, reports that said an unarmed woman had been shot for no reason. Maybe it was the fact that alien species were already asking questions about what happened, their diplomats sending formal inquiries to coalition headquarters. Or maybe it was just her instinct, the same instinct that had made her good at this job, telling her that something was very wrong here. She sat in a small office aboard the transport ship that orbited above New Savannah and watched the checkpoint footage 3 times. The first time she watched it at normal speed, seeing Maya Johnson approach the checkpoint, seeing the alarm go off, seeing Morrison draw his weapon and fire. The second time she watched it in slow motion, counting the seconds between Morrison's order and Maya's compliance, measuring the distance between them, noting every detail of body language and positioning. The third time she watched it with the sound off, focusing only on what the images showed without being influenced by voices or ambient noise. When she finished watching, she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes and felt anger rising in her chest. The footage was clear. Maya Johnson had done nothing wrong. She had raised her hands immediately. She had not advanced toward Morrison. She had not reached for anything that could be considered a weapon. Morrison had shot her anyway, and there was no possible justification for it that Linda could see. She started digging deeper, pulling Morrison's service records and going through his reports from the past 2 years. What she found made her anger turn cold and sharp. Morrison had been filing incident reports at an unusually high rate, claiming he had detected threats or suspicious behavior in people passing through his checkpoint. Linda pulled up the names from those reports and ran them through the colony demographic database. 91% of the people Morrison had reported were not white. In a colony where 57% of the population was not white, that pattern was statistically impossible unless Morrison was specifically targeting people based on their appearance. Linda had seen patterns like this before, had investigated officers who let their biases influence their work, but this was one of the clearest examples she had ever encountered. She called Morrison in for an interview 2 days after arriving on New Savannah. He sat across from her in an interrogation room that was deliberately kept cold and uncomfortable. His lawyer sat beside him, a man named Christopher Barnes who worked for the Coalition Officers Union and specialized in defending security personnel who got into trouble. Barnes had already filed motions trying to limit what Linda could ask and what evidence she could use, but Linda had decades of experience getting around lawyers, and she knew how to ask questions that Barnes could not block. Morrison looked tired and defensive. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his face was pale and his hands kept moving, touching the table, touching his chair, never quite still. Linda started with simple questions, establishing timeline and basic facts. Then she moved to the critical moment. The footage shows Maya Johnson raised her hands within 1.3 seconds of your command, Linda said, keeping her voice neutral. Why did you fire your weapon 2 seconds after she complied? Morrison looked at his lawyer, then back at Linda. The situation was evolving rapidly and I had to make a split-second decision based on my perception of the threat level. What threat did you perceive? Linda asked. The scanner detected an unknown energy signature in her belongings and she was acting nervous. Linda pulled up an image on her data pad, a still frame from the footage showing Maya's face. This is her expression 1 second before you fired. Does this look like threatening behavior to you? Morrison stared at the image and said nothing. Linda tried a different approach. Officer Morrison, I have reviewed your incident reports from the past 18 months. You have filed 34 reports claiming suspicious behavior or potential threats. 31 of those reports involved people of color. Can you explain that pattern? Barnes objected immediately, claiming the question was irrelevant and prejudicial, but Linda cut him off. Officer Morrison is being investigated for killing an unarmed woman. His history of targeting people based on their race is absolutely relevant to understanding why he pulled the trigger when there was no legitimate threat present. Morrison's face went red. I do not target people based on race, and I resent the implication. Then explain the numbers, Linda said flatly. Explain why 91% of your reports involve non-white colonists when they make up 57% of the population. Morrison had no answer that made sense. He talked about high crime areas and suspicious patterns in his training about threat assessment, but his words were empty and Linda could see that even Barnes knew it. The interview ended with nothing resolved, but with Linda more certain than ever that Morrison had killed Maya Johnson because of his own biases, his own assumptions about who was dangerous based on nothing more than skin color. She spent the next 4 days interviewing other people, building her case piece by piece. She talked to the technician who had analyzed the energy signature from Maya's bacteria samples, and who explained that any trained officer should have recognized it as harmless. She talked to other officers who had worked with Morrison, and who quietly admitted that he seemed to have problems with non-white colonists, that he was always more aggressive with them, always more suspicious. She talked to colonists who had been stopped by Morrison, and who described his behavior as hostile and biased. By the end of the week, Linda had built a case that left no room for doubt. Officer Kyle Morrison had violated multiple protocols when he shot Maya Johnson. He had fired his weapon when no threat existed. He had allowed his racial biases to influence his perception and his actions, and Maya Johnson was dead because of it. Linda filed her report with Coalition headquarters and recommended that Morrison be charged with negligent homicide. The recommendation went up the chain of command, and within 48 hours the decision came back. Morrison would face trial in a civilian court on New Savannah, with the whole galaxy watching to see if humanity would actually hold one of their own accountable for killing an innocent woman. News of Maya Johnson's death spread through human space faster than anyone expected. Within 3 days, her name was known on every colony from the inner worlds to the frontier territories. Her picture appeared on news feeds and social networks, a smiling young woman in a lab coat holding up a container of glowing bacteria. People shared stories about her research, about her plans to help feed growing colonial populations, about her dreams of making the galaxy a better place. Protests began on New Savannah first. Hundreds of colonists marched through the streets carrying signs that demanded justice for Maya. Many of them were people of color who had left Earth, hoping to escape the discrimination and violence they had faced there, only to find that humanity had brought those same problems to the stars. They marched peacefully, but their anger was real and visible, and the colonial government watched nervously as the crowds grew larger each day. Then something unexpected happened. The alien species that shared the galaxy with humanity started paying attention. The Zythani were a species of crystalline beings who communicated through light and vibration. They had been the first aliens humanity encountered when Earth developed faster than light travel, and they had helped humans navigate the complex politics of galactic civilization. Their ambassador to the Coalition Council was named Crystallith 7, a being that stood 3 meters tall and refracted light into rainbow patterns when it moved. Crystallith 7 issued a formal statement that was broadcast across every Coalition channel. "We have watched humanity expand into the galaxy with interest and hope," the translated words said. "You are a young species with great potential, capable of remarkable creativity and growth. But we have also observed patterns in your behavior that concern us deeply. The death of Maya Johnson is not an isolated incident. It is part of a long history of violence that humans inflict on each other based on physical differences that mean nothing to the rest of us. We hoped you would leave this darkness behind when you left your homeworld. We are disappointed to see you carry it with you to the stars." The statement was diplomatic, but the message was clear. The Zythani were questioning whether humanity deserved to be part of galactic civilization if they could not stop killing each other over skin color. Other species followed with their own statements. The Vren Collective was a hive mind species that controlled 17 star systems through a network of billions of individual drones. They operated on pure logic and efficiency, and they saw human racial violence as an irrational waste of resources. Their spokesperson, a drone designated Vren Prime 447, announced that the collective was suspending all trade agreements with human colonies until Morrison's trial was complete and justice was served. The economic impact hit human space like a shockwave. Ships carrying vital supplies were turned away from Vren ports. Construction projects that depended on Vren technology ground to a halt. Colonies that had been expanding suddenly found themselves cut off from the resources they needed. The coalition government went into emergency sessions trying to manage the crisis, but there was nothing they could do except wait for the trial to play out. More alien species joined in. The Keltharian Assembly, the Morphic Collective, the Silicon Accord, all of them issued statements expressing concern about human behavior. Some were diplomatic, others were blunt, but the message was always the same. The galaxy was watching to see if humans could actually deliver justice, or if they would protect their own and let Morrison escape consequences for killing an innocent woman. The pressure on the coalition government became intense. Politicians who had never cared much about racial justice suddenly found themselves forced to care because the entire economic and diplomatic structure of human space was at risk. Military leaders worried about security, about what would happen if humanity lost its alien allies and trading partners. Business executives watched their profits disappear as trade routes closed and contracts were canceled. Commander Peter Walsh called an emergency meeting of coalition leadership to discuss the crisis. He was the head of coalition security, a broad-shouldered man with gray hair and a reputation for solving problems through force when necessary. He looked around the conference table at the assembled officials and did not bother hiding his frustration. "This is a disaster," Walsh said. "One incident, one dead colonist, and suddenly we are facing economic collapse and diplomatic isolation. We need to contain this situation before it gets worse." Several officials nodded in agreement. They talked about public relations campaigns, about fast-tracking the trial, about ways to minimize the damage and get alien species to back down. But Linda Hayes, who had been called to the meeting to brief everyone on her investigation, sat quietly and listened until she could not stay quiet anymore. "With respect, Commander, you are thinking about this wrong," Linda said. "This is not a public relations problem. This is a justice problem. Maya Johnson is dead because an officer who was supposed to protect her decided she was dangerous based on nothing except her skin color. The aliens are not wrong to be concerned about that. They are asking us to prove that we meant what we said when we wrote laws about equality and justice. If we try to contain this or minimize it or make it go away quietly, we will prove that those laws are meaningless." Walsh looked at her like she had said something offensive. "What do you suggest then? We just let this trial proceed and hope the aliens accept whatever verdict comes out?" "Yes," Linda said simply. "We let justice happen. We prosecute Morrison fairly but thoroughly. We present all the evidence. We let the jury decide based on facts and law, and we accept the verdict whatever it is. If we do anything less, the aliens will know we are not serious about justice. They will know our laws are just words on paper that we ignore whenever it is convenient." Another official, a civilian administrator named Margaret Stone, spoke up. "And what if the verdict is not guilty? What if the jury acquits Morrison? The aliens will see that as proof that we protect our own no matter what they do." Linda met her eyes. "Then we will have a different problem. But we cannot rig a trial to satisfy alien observers. We can only do what is right and hope that the evidence is strong enough to lead to a just verdict. And in this case, the evidence is very strong." The meeting broke up without any clear resolution. Coalition leadership was divided between those who wanted to manage the crisis politically and those who believed Linda was right about letting justice proceed naturally. But ultimately the decision was made. The trial would go forward in a civilian court on New Savannah, conducted according to standard coalition law, with no interference from politicians or military leaders. The whole galaxy would be watching. Humanity's reputation, their place in galactic civilization, their economic and diplomatic relationships, all of it would depend on what happened in one courtroom on one colony world, where a young woman had died for no reason except the color of her skin. The courthouse on New Savannah was built from local stone, a simple 2-story building with tall windows that let in natural light. It had been designed to serve a small colonial population, to handle minor disputes and occasional criminal cases. Nobody who designed it ever imagined it would become the center of galactic attention. But that was exactly what happened when Kyle Morrison's trial began. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered behind security barriers that colonial police had set up to keep order. Protesters held signs demanding justice for Maya, chanting slogans that news drones recorded and transmitted across human space. Some people had traveled from other colonies just to be there, to witness history, to make sure their voices were heard. The atmosphere was tense but not violent. Anger mixed with hope that maybe this time the system would work the way it was supposed to. Above the courthouse alien observer, drones floated silently, recording everything for species that wanted to see how humans handled justice. The Zithani had sent representatives who stood at the edge of the crowd, their crystalline bodies catching sunlight and throwing rainbow patterns across the ground. Vren drones moved through the area collecting data. Dozens of other species had observers present, all of them watching to see if humanity would live up to its promises about equality and law. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled. Journalists from across human space sat in the press section with their recording equipment. Maya Johnson's family occupied the front row, her mother Patricia sitting with perfect posture and dry eyes, her grief visible in the tightness of her jaw and the rigid way she held herself. Behind them sat colonists who had known Maya or had worked with her, people who wanted to see justice done for a woman who had been trying to make their world better. Judge Margaret Cole entered the courtroom at exactly 9 in the morning. She was 63 years old with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been a judge on Earth before retiring to New Savannah, hoping for a quiet life away from the intensity of Earth's overcrowded courts. That hope had died with Maya Johnson, but Margaret was not the kind of person who ran from duty just because it was difficult. She looked out over the packed courtroom and spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner. This trial will be conducted according to coalition law. I do not care how many species are watching, or how many protesters are outside, or what the political implications might be. In this courtroom we deal with facts and evidence and law. Nothing else matters. Is that understood? Everyone nodded or murmured agreement. Margaret's reputation for running a fair but strict courtroom was well known, and nobody wanted to test her patience. Kyle Morrison sat at the defense table between his two lawyers. He wore a dark suit instead of his coalition uniform, a choice his legal team had made to make him look more like a regular person and less like an authority figure. His face was pale and his hands rested flat on the table in front of him, not quite steady. His lead lawyer, Christopher Barnes, sat beside him looking confident. But it was the kind of confidence that came from years of practice, rather than any real strength in their case. The prosecution table held District Attorney Vanessa Price and her assistant, a young lawyer named Daniel Cooper who was handling evidence and witness coordination. Vanessa was a black woman in her 40s, who had grown up in Earth's slums before earning a scholarship to law school and eventually joining the colonial justice system. She carried the weight of this case like a physical burden, knowing that millions of people were counting on her to deliver justice for Maya Johnson. Vanessa stood to give her opening statement. She walked to the center of the courtroom and looked at the jury, 12 colonists who had been selected after days of careful questioning. Then she began to speak in a calm, measured voice that somehow made her words more powerful. Maya Johnson was 26 years old. She had a degree in xenobotany and was working to develop crops that could feed millions of people across human space. She was excited about her research. She had called her mother the night before she died to talk about a breakthrough with her bacteria cultures. She was planning to visit home in 3 months. Vanessa paused and let the silence fill the courtroom. She never made it. Because Officer Kyle Morrison, a man who was trained to protect and serve the people of this colony, made a choice, not a split-second decision forced on him by genuine danger. A choice that came from bias and fear and assumptions that had nothing to do with Maya Johnson's actual behavior. The evidence will show that Maya did nothing wrong. She complied with every instruction. She posed no threat, and Kyle Morrison killed her anyway. She returned to her seat and Christopher Barnes stood up for the defense opening statement. He was a tall man with perfect hair and an expensive suit, someone who looked like he had never missed a meal or worried about paying rent. He spoke about the difficult job coalition security officers did, about the real threats that existed in colonial space, about the split-second decisions officers had to make every day. He tried to paint Morrison as a dedicated public servant who made an honest mistake under pressure, but his words rang hollow in the courtroom. Everyone there had seen the footage that had been released to the public, the video showing Maya with her hands up and Morrison firing anyway. Barnes was asking them to ignore what their own eyes had shown them, and even he seemed to know it was not working. The first witness was the security technician who had been monitoring the checkpoint scanners that morning. Her name was Susan Clark, and she was nervous about testifying, her hands shaking slightly as she took the oath. But her testimony was clear and damning. The scanner detected a Class C bioelectrical signature, Susan explained. That is standard for any bioluminescent organisms. The system flagged it because it was unusual, not because it represented any danger. Any trained security officer would recognize that signature as harmless. Vanessa asked her to explain what protocol required when the scanner detected a Class C signature. Susan said that protocol called for the officer to request that the person open their container for visual inspection. There was no protocol that called for drawing a weapon, because Class C signatures were known to be non-threatening. Christopher Barnes tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, but Susan held firm. She had been working with security scanners for 8 years and knew exactly what the readings meant. There was no way to interpret that energy signature as dangerous, and any officer who thought otherwise was either poorly trained or deliberately ignoring what the scanner was telling them. The key next witness was the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Maya's body. His testimony was clinical and precise, describing the path of the plasma bolt through her chest, the damage it caused to her heart and lungs, the speed with which she died. Maya would have lost consciousness within seconds and died within 4 minutes. There was nothing anyone could have done to save her once Morrison pulled the trigger. The courtroom was silent as the medical examiner spoke. Patricia Johnson sat in the front row with tears running down her face, but she never looked away. She listened to every word about how her daughter died, bearing witness to Maya's last moments with a strength that seemed impossible. By the end of the first day, the prosecution had established the basic facts. Maya Johnson had been killed by Kyle Morrison. The energy signature that triggered the alarm was harmless. Maya had complied with Morrison's orders. Nothing she did justified the use of deadly force. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses and more evidence, building toward the moment when the jury would have to decide what kind of justice they believed in. The second day of the trial began with video analysis that would prove impossible for the defense to overcome. Gregory Sanders took the stand, a forensic expert who specialized in analyzing security footage for coalition investigations. He had spent the past week studying every frame of the checkpoint video, measuring distances and timing and body language with scientific precision. Vanessa Price asked him to walk the jury through what the footage showed. The courtroom lights dimmed and the video appeared on large screens mounted on the walls. Gregory used a laser pointer to highlight details as he spoke. At timestamp 08:47:23, Maya Johnson approaches the checkpoint. Her stride is even, her posture is relaxed. There are no signs of stress or aggressive intent in her body language. At 08:47:31, the scanner alarm sounds. You can see her reaction here. The video froze on Maya's face, showing surprise and confusion. This is a genuine reaction to an unexpected event. Her eyes widen, her mouth opens slightly, her shoulders tense. This is not the reaction of someone who is expecting trouble or carrying something dangerous. This is someone who is confused. Gregory advanced the video frame by frame. At 08:47:33, Officer Morrison issues his first command to raise her hands. You can see Maya beginning to react here. At 08:47:34.3, her hands begin to move upward. By 08:47:35, her hands are fully raised above her head with palms open and facing the officer. This is complete compliance achieved in 1.3 seconds from the initial command. He let that sink in, then continued. At 08:47:37, Officer Morrison fires his weapon. 2 full seconds after Maya Johnson achieved complete compliance with his order. In those 2 seconds, Ms. Johnson made no threatening movements. She did not reach for anything. She did not advance toward the officer. She stood still with her hands raised, clearly visible, clearly unarmed, clearly compliant. The video played in slow motion, showing those final seconds. Maya standing perfectly still, hands up, face showing fear. Morrison with his weapon raised, finger tightening on the trigger. The flash of the plasma bolt. Maya falling, Christopher Barnes objected, claiming the slow motion was prejudicial and made Morrison's actions look worse than they were. Judge Cole overruled him. The jury is entitled to see exactly what happened at whatever speed allows them to understand the facts. Objection denied. Gregory continued his testimony, analyzing Morrison's positioning and sight lines. Officer Morrison had a clear, unobstructed view of Ms. Johnson at all times. The lighting was excellent. There was nothing blocking his ability to see that she was complying with his orders. There was nothing that would prevent him from recognizing that she posed no threat. On cross-examination, Barnes tried to argue about perception and stress and how things look different in the moment than they do on video. But Gregory had anticipated every argument. He showed data about human reaction times, about how long it takes to assess a situation, about what officers are trained to look for when determining threat levels. By every measure, Morrison had more than enough time to recognize that Maya was complying and posed no danger. The testimony was devastating, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's next witness was Linda Hayes. She took the stand on the third day of the trial and laid out the results of her investigation. With clinical precision, she explained how she had reviewed Morrison's service record, how she had analyzed his incident reports, how she had interviewed other officers and colonists who had interacted with him. Then Vanessa asked her about the pattern she had found. Officer Morrison filed 34 incident reports in the 18 months. Before Maya Johnson's death, Linda testified. These were reports claiming he had detected suspicious behavior or potential threats at his checkpoint. I analyzed those reports against the demographic data for New Savannah's population. She pulled up charts on the courtroom screens showing the numbers. New Savannah's colonial population is 43% white, 28% black, 18% Latino, and 11% other ethnicities. If Officer Morrison's reports were random, we would expect them to roughly match those demographics. Instead, I found that 91% of his reports involved people of color. Linda looked directly at the jury. I ran statistical analysis on this data. The probability of this pattern occurring by random chance is less than 0.001%. This was not random. This was systematic targeting of people based on their race. Christopher Barnes fought hard to keep this testimony out, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific incident involving Maya Johnson. But Judge Cole ruled that Morrison's pattern of behavior was directly relevant to understanding his state of mind when he encountered Maya. The defendant's history of targeting people of color goes directly to the question of why he perceived a threat. Where none existed, Judge Cole said, the jury has a right to hear this evidence. Linda went on to describe interviews she had conducted with colonists who had been stopped by Morrison. All of them described similar experiences, being treated with suspicion and hostility for no apparent reason. Several testified that Morrison seemed to assume they were criminals or troublemakers just because of their appearance. One witness, a man named Carlos Martinez, described being detained by Morrison for 20 minutes while Morrison searched his belongings for contraband that did not exist. He kept asking me where I got my work permit, like he did not believe I had a right to be there, Carlos testified. I showed him my papers 3 times, but he kept looking for something wrong. Finally, he let me go, but he said he would be watching me. I did not do anything. I was just trying to go to work. Story after story painted the same picture. Morrison had been carrying racial bias into his work for months or years. He saw threats where none existed, but only when he was looking at people with dark skin. Maya Johnson had been the latest victim of that bias, but she had not been the first person he had targeted. She had just been unlucky enough to encounter him on a day when his bias escalated to deadly force. By the end of the 3rd day, the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. The evidence showed that Maya had done nothing wrong, that she had complied with Morrison's orders, that the energy signature from her bacteria was harmless, and that Morrison had a documented history of racial bias in his work. The only question left was whether the jury would have the courage to hold a coalition officer accountable for killing an innocent woman. Outside the courthouse, news of the testimony spread rapidly. Alien observers sent reports back to their homeworlds describing what they had heard. The Zithani ambassador issued a statement saying that humanity appeared to be taking the trial seriously, that the evidence being presented was thorough and damning. The Vren Collective remained silent. waiting to see what verdict would emerge before deciding whether to restore trade relations. On New Savannah, protesters continued their vigil outside the courthouse. Maya Johnson's face appeared on signs and screens throughout the colony. Her mother, Patricia, attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and listening to every word of testimony about how her daughter died. She never spoke to the press, never gave interviews, but her presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. This was not just about politics or diplomacy or galactic relations. This was about a young woman who had been killed for no reason, and about whether the system would deliver justice for her death. Christopher Barnes knew his defense was falling apart, but he had no choice except to keep fighting. On the fourth day of the trial, he called his first witness, a coalition training instructor named Richard Scott, who had taught courses on threat assessment and use of force. Barnes was hoping Richard would testify that Morrison's actions fell within acceptable parameters, that any officer in the same situation might have made the same choice. It did not work out that way. Richard took the stand and described the training that coalition officers received. He explained protocols for scanning procedures, for dealing with alarms, for assessing whether someone posed a genuine threat. Then Vanessa Price stood up for cross-examination and asked him a simple question. Based on the training you provide, was Officer Morrison's use of deadly force justified in this situation? Richard hesitated. He had been called as a defense witness, and his answer was supposed to help Morrison. But he was also a man who had spent 30 years training officers and took his work seriously. He looked at the video footage that was displayed on the courtroom screens, showing Maya with her hands up, and his face grew troubled. "No," he said quietly. "Based on what I see in this footage, the use of deadly force was not justified. The subject was compliant. There was no weapon visible. The energy signature from the scanner was a known, non-threatening type. Protocol would have called for a visual inspection of the container, not for drawing a weapon." Barnes tried to salvage the testimony, asking Richard about the stress officer's face and how things can look different in the moment. But Richard would not budge from his assessment. "I understand stress. I teach officers how to manage it. But 2 seconds is more than enough time to recognize compliance. If an officer cannot tell the difference between a threat and a scared civilian with their hands up, that officer should not be working checkpoints." The defense called other witnesses, trying to establish that Morrison had been under pressure, that the colony security situation was tense, that mistakes happen in dangerous work. But none of it addressed the central question. Why had Morrison fired when Maya was clearly complying? Why had he seen a threat where none existed? On the 5th day, Barnes made the decision to put Morrison on the stand. It was a huge risk because it meant Morrison would have to face cross-examination from Vanessa Price. But Barnes believed they had no choice. The jury needed to hear directly from Morrison, needed to see him as a human being who made a mistake, rather than as the cold figure in the video footage. Morrison took the stand wearing his suit and looking like he had not slept well in days. Barnes asked him gentle questions, letting him talk about his 15 years of service, about the difficult situations he had faced, about his commitment to protecting colonists. Morrison's answers were rehearsed and careful, hitting all the points his lawyers had told him to emphasize. Then Vanessa Price stood up for cross-examination and everything changed. "Officer Morrison, you testified that you felt threatened by Maya Johnson," Vanessa began. "Can you describe specifically what made you feel threatened?" Morrison shifted in his seat. "The scanner detected an unusual energy signature and she seemed nervous. She seemed nervous after an alarm went off unexpectedly at a security checkpoint," Vanessa said. "Would you say that is a reasonable reaction to being startled?" "I suppose so. The video shows Maya Johnson raised her hands within 1.3 seconds of your command. Did you see her hands go up?" "Yes." "Did you see any weapons in her hands?" "No, but I could not be sure what else she might have." Vanessa pulled up the video frame showing Maya with her hands raised. "What in this image suggests to you that she might have a hidden weapon?" Morrison stared at the screen and said nothing. "Officer Morrison, you fired your weapon 2 full seconds after Maya Johnson complied with your order. What were you thinking during those 2 seconds?" "I was assessing the threat level. For 2 seconds you assessed a woman standing still with her hands in the air, and your conclusion was that she needed to be shot?" Morrison's face went red. "It is easy to judge from here. You were not there. You did not feel what I felt. What did you feel? Vanessa asked. What specifically about Maya Johnson made you afraid? The question hung in the air. Morrison opened his mouth and closed it again. He knew what his lawyers had told him to say, the safe answers about situational awareness and officer safety, but the truth was something else, something he could barely admit to himself. I see threats everywhere, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. That is what the training teaches you. To always be alert, to always watch for danger. And yes, maybe I am more alert around certain people. Maybe I have been conditioned to see some people as more dangerous than others. Some people, Vanessa repeated. You mean people of color? Barnes objected, but Judge Cole overruled him. Morrison had opened this door himself. I did not consciously think about it, Morrison said. But I guess looking back, I can see that I did react differently. It was not intentional. It is just how I was wired after years of working in places where there was a lot of crime, and the crime statistics showed certain patterns. What patterns? Vanessa pressed. That certain demographics were more likely to be involved in criminal activity. And you applied those statistical patterns to Maya Johnson, a botanist carrying bacteria samples to her lab. You saw a young black woman and your training told you she was dangerous. Morrison looked at his hands. I made a mistake. I know that now. I wish I could take it back. But you cannot, Vanessa said softly. Maya Johnson is dead. She died because you saw danger where none existed. She died because of bias that you admit you carried into your work. She died because in that critical moment you did not see a person. You saw a threat based on nothing except the color of her skin. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Morrison sat in the witness box with his shoulders slumped and his face pale. He had just admitted to the racial bias that had killed Maya Johnson, and everyone in the courtroom had heard it. Barnes tried to repair the damage when he got Morrison back for redirect examination, but there was nothing he could say that would erase what Morrison had confessed. The defense case was over. That night, the footage of Morrison's testimony was broadcast across every human colony and sent to every alien civilization that had been watching the trial. The Zithani ambassador made a statement acknowledging that Morrison's admission was significant, that it showed at least some humans were capable of recognizing their own biases. The Vren Collective remained silent, but their observer drones continued recording every moment of the trial. On New Savannah, protesters outside the courthouse held candlelight vigils. Maya Johnson's picture glowed on thousands of screens. Her mother, Patricia, sat in her temporary quarters and watched the testimony over and over, crying silently for the daughter she would never see again. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the jury would deliberate. The whole galaxy waited to see what verdict they would reach. Rain fell on New Savannah the morning of closing arguments, the first significant rain the colony had seen in weeks. Water ran down the courthouse windows and pooled in the streets where protesters had gathered with their signs and their hopes. The weather felt appropriate somehow, as if the planet itself was mourning what had happened and what was about to be decided. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled again. Patricia Johnson sat in her usual spot in the front row, her hands folded in her lap and her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had cried until there were no tears left. Behind her sat dozens of colonists who had known Maya or worked with her, people who had come every day to bear witness. The press section was packed with journalists from across human space. Alien observers watched from their designated area, their recording equipment capturing every moment. Christopher Barnes stood up to give his closing argument first. He was still polished and professional, still hitting his marks like the experienced trial lawyer he was, but there was a defeated quality to his performance now. He knew what the evidence showed, and he knew what Morrison had admitted on the stand. The best he could hope for was to plant enough doubt that maybe one or two jurors would vote to acquit. This case is about a mistake, Barnes began. A terrible, tragic mistake made by a man who dedicated 15 years of his life to protecting people. Officer Morrison is not a murderer. He is not a monster. He is a human being who made a split-second decision in a tense situation and got it wrong. We have all made mistakes. The question is whether we destroy a man's entire life because of one terrible error in judgment. He talked about the pressures on coalition security, about the real threats that existed, about how easy it was to judge decisions in hindsight. He asked the jury to consider whether they would want their own mistakes examined this closely, whether they would want their whole lives defined by their worst moment. It was a competent closing argument that made all the points the defense needed to make. But it was not enough, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Vanessa Price stood up for the prosecution's closing argument, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. She did not go to the lectern. Instead, she walked to the center of the courtroom and spoke directly to the jury in a voice that carried to every corner. Christopher Barnes just asked you to think about mistakes you have made in your lives. That is a fair question. We have all made mistakes. But here is another question. Have any of your mistakes resulted in the death of an innocent person? Have any of your mistakes been the direct result of racial bias that you carried into your work, despite training that told you such bias was wrong? She paused and looked at each juror in turn. This trial is about more than Kyle Morrison's mistake. It is about what kind of society we want to be as we spread across the galaxy. Do we want to carry Earth's worst impulses with us to the stars? Do we want to perpetuate patterns of violence and discrimination that have caused suffering for centuries? Or do we want to be better? Vanessa gestured toward the screen showing Maya Johnson's picture. Maya Johnson came to New Savannah to help people. She was working on bacteria that could light buildings without using power. She was developing crops that could feed millions. She was excited about her work and about the future. She called her mother the night before she died and talked about coming home to visit. She had plans. She had dreams. She had a life. Her voice grew stronger. Kyle Morrison took that life. Not because Maya did anything wrong. Not because she posed any threat. But because when he looked at her, he saw danger based on nothing except her skin color. He admitted that on the stand. He told you that he was conditioned to see certain people as threatening. He told you that he reacted differently to people of color, and Maya Johnson died because of that bias. Vanessa walked closer to the jury box. The defense wants you to see this as a simple mistake. But mistakes have consequences. When a security officer's mistake costs an innocent life, that officer must be held accountable. That is what justice means. That is what the law requires. And that is what Maya Johnson and her family and everyone watching this trial across the galaxy deserves. She returned to her seat, and the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Then Judge Cole gave the jury their instructions, explaining the law they needed to apply and the standard of proof required for conviction. She sent them to deliberate at 11:30 in the morning. The waiting began. Outside the courthouse, protesters stood in the rain and watched the live feeds on their screens. News crews speculated about how long deliberations might take and what the verdict would be. Alien observers transmitted updates to their homeworlds. The Zithani ambassador gave an interview saying that regardless of the verdict, the trial had shown that at least some humans were serious about confronting their own biases. The Vren Collective remained silent. Inside, Patricia Johnson sat in a private room with a victim advocate and waited. She did not watch the news coverage or check her messages. She just sat quietly and thought about her daughter, about Maya's laugh and her excitement about her work and all the things that would never happen now. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes. At 2:44 in the afternoon, they sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread. Judge Cole took her seat and called for order. The jury filed in, their faces showing the weight of what they had decided. The forewoman was a woman named Karen Foster, a colonist who worked in agriculture and had probably known Maya by reputation, if not personally. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Cole asked. "We have, Your Honor. What say you?" Karen Foster stood up. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the data pad with the verdict, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. "On the charge of negligent homicide, we find the defendant Kyle Morrison guilty." The courtroom exploded, not with violence or chaos, but with a wave of emotion that had been held back for too long. People cried and embraced each other. Some shouted yes, while others sat in stunned silence. Patricia Johnson collapsed forward in her seat, sobbing into her hands as the victim advocate held her. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard even through the courthouse walls. Judge Cole struck her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Slowly, the room quieted enough for her to continue. She looked at Morrison, who sat at the defense table with his head in his hands. "Officer Morrison, the jury has found you guilty of negligent homicide in the death of Maya Johnson. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything you wish to say?" Morrison stood slowly. His face was pale and his eyes were red. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Then he looked up at Patricia Johnson and spoke in a voice that shook. "I am sorry. I know those words mean nothing. I know they do not bring Maya back. I know they do not undo what I did. But I am sorry. I was wrong about everything. About my assumptions, about my biases, about what I thought I was seeing that morning. Maya Johnson did nothing wrong, and she is dead because I failed to see her as a person. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. Patricia Johnson looked at him and said nothing. Her expression showed no forgiveness, but perhaps the smallest acknowledgement that he had finally told the truth. Judge Cole considered for a moment, then delivered her sentence. Kyle Morrison, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in a coalition detention facility. You will be eligible for parole after serving 12 years. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell and Morrison was led away in restraints. The courtroom slowly emptied as people filed out into the rainy afternoon. News crews scrambled to get reactions. Alien observers transmitted the verdict across the galaxy within seconds. The trial was over. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, had been served. But the work of healing, of changing, of becoming better was only beginning. News of the verdict spread through human space and beyond faster than light itself. Within hours, every colony knew that Kyle Morrison had been found guilty and sentenced to 20 years. Within a day, every alien civilization that had been watching the trial knew the outcome. The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Zithani were the first to respond. Crystallith 7 appeared before the Coalition Council chambers just 6 hours after the verdict was announced. The ambassador's crystalline body refracted, the chamber lights into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls as they spoke. We have watched humanity struggle with this trial, and with the questions it raised about your society. We have seen your laws tested, and we have seen those laws upheld. Officer Morrison was held accountable for his actions. The victim's family was given justice. This is what we hope to see. The Zithani Collective is satisfied that humanity takes its own laws seriously. We will continue our partnership with human colonies, and we look forward to seeing the reforms you implement to prevent future tragedies. The statement was formal and diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Humanity had passed the test. The Zithani would not abandon their alliance or cut off relations. The first and most important hurdle had been cleared. The Vren Collective took longer to respond. Their hive mind processed the trial data for 3 full days, analyzing every piece of testimony and every moment of deliberation. When their decision came, it arrived as a simple data transmission to Coalition headquarters. The verdict demonstrates that human justice systems are capable of functioning as designed. Trade agreements will be reinstated immediately. The Vren Collective will continue monitoring human colonies for evidence of systemic bias in law enforcement. Future incidents will be evaluated based on how they are handled. This verdict has earned humanity a renewed opportunity to prove they are worthy of galactic partnership. Within hours of the Vren announcement, supply ships that had been turned away from Vren ports were given clearance to dock. Construction projects using Vren technology resumed. The economic pressure that had been building for weeks began to ease. Human colonies could breathe again. Other species issued their own statements over the following days. Most were positive, acknowledging that humanity had shown a willingness to confront its own darkness. A few remained skeptical, pointing out that one verdict did not erase centuries of racial violence or guarantee that real change would happen. But even the skeptics agreed that the trial had been conducted fairly, and that justice had been served in Maya Johnson's case. On New Savannah, life began to return to normal, though the colony was forever changed by what had happened. The memorial to Maya Johnson in the main plaza became a gathering place where people left flowers and notes. Colonists who had never thought much about racial bias started having conversations about how they saw the world and how their assumptions affected others. It was uncomfortable work, the kind of change that happened slowly and with difficulty, but it was happening. Coalition security underwent massive reforms in the wake of the trial. Commander Peter Walsh was forced to resign after an internal investigation found that he had ignored warning signs about Morrison's bias for months. His replacement, a woman named Beverly Price, who was no relation to the prosecutor, implemented sweeping changes. All security officers were required to complete intensive bias training. Use of force protocols were rewritten with stricter standards for when deadly force could be employed. Independent oversight boards were established on every colony world to investigate incidents where officers used force against civilians. The changes were not perfect, and they did not happen overnight. Some officers resisted the new training and complained that they were being restricted in how they could do their jobs. Some colonies were slow to implement the reforms, but the direction was clear. The coalition was acknowledging that racial bias existed in its ranks and was taking concrete steps to address it. Linda Hayes retired from coalition service 6 months after the trial ended. She had spent more than a decade investigating officer misconduct and had seen too many cases where nothing changed despite clear evidence of wrongdoing. The Morrison verdict gave her hope that real change was possible, but she was tired of fighting battles that should never have needed to be fought. She returned to Earth and wrote a detailed account of her investigation into Morrison's background and the patterns of bias she had found. The book became required reading in every Coalition Security Training Academy. Vanessa Price was appointed to represent New Savannah on the Coalition Council. She accepted the position with some reluctance, knowing it would take her away from trial work. But she believed she could do more good influencing policy than prosecuting individual cases. She kept Maya Johnson's picture on her desk in her council office, a reminder of why the work mattered and what was at stake when the system failed. Christopher Barnes continued practicing law but found that defending officers accused of misconduct had become much harder after the Morrison trial. Juries were less willing to accept excuses about split-second decisions when video evidence showed clear violations of protocol. Barnes eventually shifted his practice to other areas of law, quietly acknowledging that the landscape had changed. Kyle Morrison served his sentence in a coalition detention facility on a remote mining colony. He participated in every rehabilitation program offered and attended counseling sessions twice a week. Whether he truly understood and overcame his biases was a question without a clear answer. Some people believed he was genuinely remorseful and working to change. Others thought he was just going through the motions to improve his chances at parole. Perhaps the truth was somewhere in between. A man who had caused terrible harm trying to become better but never quite able to fully escape what he had done. But perhaps the most significant changes happened in the small moments that no news crews recorded and no alien observers analyzed. A security officer on a frontier colony paused before drawing his weapon and realized the person in front of him posed no actual threat. A colonist spoke up when she saw someone being treated differently because of their skin color. A training instructor added a new section to his course about recognizing bias in real time. A jury convicted another officer who used excessive force, emboldened by the precedent Morrison's case had set. Maya Johnson's research was completed by her colleagues, who dedicated every breakthrough to her memory. The bioluminescent bacteria she had been studying when she died were eventually used to create sustainable lighting systems across human colonies. Buildings lit by softly glowing bacteria became common on frontier worlds, reducing energy consumption and helping terraform new planets. Every time someone walked into a building lit by that gentle blue-green glow, they were seeing Maya's legacy made real. Patricia Johnson remained on New Savannah for a year after the trial ended. She visited the memorial to her daughter every day and spoke with colonists who had known Maya. She read the notes that people left and listened to their stories about how her daughter had touched their lives. Eventually, she returned to Earth, but she carried Maya's memory with her and became an advocate for criminal justice reform. She spoke at conferences and universities, telling Maya's story and demanding that humanity do better. The trial had shown the galaxy that humans were capable of acknowledging their flaws and delivering justice when their own laws were violated. It had proven that at least some humans were willing to hold their own accountable rather than protecting people who caused harm. It was not everything, not nearly enough to make up for centuries of violence and discrimination, but it was something real. 5 years after the trial, a delegation of Zithani scholars visited New Savannah to study how human colonies were implementing bias training and oversight reforms. They toured the memorial to Maya Johnson and spoke with colonists about what had changed since her death. Their final report noted that while problems remained, humanity had shown a capacity for growth that gave hope for their future as members of galactic civilization. 10 years after the trial, a young security officer named Daniel Chen was working a checkpoint on a frontier colony when his scanner detected an unusual energy signature. He felt his hand move toward his weapon automatically, felt old training trying to take over. Then he stopped, took a breath, and remembered Maya Johnson's name. He asked the traveler to open her container for inspection. Inside were mineral samples that naturally produced low-level radiation. The traveler explained her research, and Daniel cleared her through the checkpoint with an apology for the delay. Later that night, he filed a report about the incident, noting that the scanner had functioned correctly but that he had almost overreacted. He recommended that the scanner database be updated to recognize common research materials. It was a small moment, barely worth recording, but it represented the kind of change that Maya's death had helped create. The stars turned overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. Humanity reached for them with hands that were learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be more just. The journey was long and the destination was uncertain. There would be more failures, more tragedies, more moments when bias and fear would overcome reason and justice.